dears, and welcome back to my corner of the internet. I'm Shannon, and tonight we're going to be reading some more of Emily of New Moon. If you're new to my channel or new to this series, I've got a playlist. You can go and get caught up on all the chapters we've read so far, or else you can just jump in here and give a little listen. I'm able to read this book because of Project Gutenberg, which is a website where they archive books once they reach a certain age and become public domain. So that's so fun. I love that. Discovering that website made me so excited. Anyway, you guys, tonight we're going to be reading chapter 14 and chapter 15. And chapter 14 is called Fancy Fed. In October, Cousin Jimmy began to boil the pig's potatoes. Unromantic name for a most romantic occupation. Or so it appeared to Emily, whose love of the beautiful and picturesque was satisfied, as it had never yet been on those long, cool, starry twilights of the waning year at new moon. There was a clump of spruce trees in a corner of the old orchard, and under them an immense iron pot was hung over a circle of large stones, a pot so big that an ox could have been comfortably stewed in it. Emily thought it must have come down from the days of fairy tales and been some giant's porridge pot, but Cousin Jimmy told her that it was only 100 years old, and old Hugh Murray had had it sent out from England. "We've used it ever since to boil the potatoes for the New Moon pigs," he said. "Blairwater folks think it old-fashioned. They've all got boiler houses now with built-in boilers, but as long as Elizabeth's boss at New Moon, we'll use this." Emily was sure no built-in boiler could have had the charm of the big pot. She helped Cousin Jimmy fill it full of potatoes after she came from school, and then, when supper was over, Cousin Jimmy lighted the fire under it and puttered about all evening. Sometimes he poked the fire. Emily loved that part of the performance, sending glorious streams of rosy sparks upward into the darkness. Sometimes he stirred the potatoes with a long pole, looking with his queer forked gray beard and belted jumper just like some old gnome or troll of Northland story mixing the contents of a magical cauldron. And sometimes he sat beside Emily on the gray granite boulder near the pot and recited his poetry for her. Emily liked this best of all, for Cousin Jimmy's poetry was surprisingly good, at least in spots, and Cousin Jimmy had fit audience, though few, in this slender little maiden with her pale, eager face and rapt eyes. They were an odd couple, and they were perfectly happy together. Blairwater people thought Cousin Jimmy a failure and a mental weakling, but he dwelt in an ideal world of which none of them knew anything. He had recited his poems 100 times thus, as he boiled the pig's potatoes. The ghosts of a score of autumns haunted the clump of spruces for him. He was an odd, ridiculous figure enough, bent and wrinkled and unkempt, gesticulating awkwardly as he recited, but it was his hour. He was no longer simple Jimmy Murray, but a prince in his own realm. For a little while he was strong and young and splendid and beautiful, a credited master of song to a listening, enraptured world. None of his prosperous, sensible Blairwater neighbors ever lived through such an hour. He would not have exchanged places with one of them. Emily, listening to him, felt vaguely that if he had not been for that unplucky push into the New Moon well, this little man beside her might have stood in the presence of kings. But Elizabeth had pushed him into the New Moon well, and as a consequence he boiled pig's potatoes and recited to Emily. Emily, who wrote poetry too and loved these evenings so much that she couldn't sleep after she went to bed until she had composed a minute description of them. The flash came almost every evening over something or other. The wind woman swooped and purred in the tossing boughs above them. Emily had never been so near to seeing her. The sharp air was full of the pleasant tang of the burning spruce cones Cousin Jimmy shoveled under the pot. Emily's furry kitten, Mike II, frisked and scampered about like a small charming demon of the night. The fire glowed with beautiful redness and allure through the gloom. There were nice whispery sounds everywhere. The great big dark lay spread around them, full of mysteries that daylight never revealed, and over all a purple sky powdered with stars. Elise and Teddy came too, and on some evenings Emily always knew when Teddy was coming, for when he reached the old orchard, he whistled his call, the one he used just for her. A funny, dear little call like 3 clear bird notes. The first just medium pitch, the second higher, the third dropping away into lowness and sweetness, long drawn out like the echoes of the bugle song that went clearer and further in their dying. That call always had an odd effect on Emily. It seemed to her that it fairly drew the heart out of her body. And she had to follow it. She thought Teddy could have whistled her clear across the world with those 3 magic notes. Whenever she heard it, she ran quickly through the orchard and told Teddy whether Cousin Jimmy wanted him or not, because it was only on certain nights that Cousin Jimmy wanted anybody but her. He'd never recite his poetry to Elise or Teddy, but he told them fairy stories and tales about the old, dead and gone Murrays in the pond graveyard that were strange sometimes as the fairy stories, and Elise would recite too, doing better there than she ever did anywhere else. And sometimes Teddy lay sprawled out on the ground beside the pig pot and drew pictures of the light of the fire, pictures of Cousin Jimmy stirring potatoes, pictures of Elise and Emily dancing hand in hand around it like 2 small witches, pictures of Mike's little whiskered face peering around the old boulder, pictures of weird, vague faces crowding in the darkness outside their enchanted circle. They had very wonderful evenings there, those 4 children. "Oh, don't you love the world at night, Elise?" Emily once said rapturously. Elise glanced happily around her, poor little neglected Elise, who found in Emily's companionship what she had hungered for all her short life, and who was even now being led by love into something of her rightful heritage. "Yes," she said, "and I always believe there is a God when I'm here like this." Then the potatoes were done, and Cousin Jimmy gave each of them one before he mixed in the bran. They broke them in pieces on plates of birch bark, sprinkled them with salt, which Emily had cached in a small box under the roots of the biggest spruce, and ate them with gusto. No banquet of gods was ever as delicious as those potatoes. Then finally came Aunt Laura's kind, silvery voice calling through the frosty dark. Elise and Teddy scampered homewards, and Emily captured Mike the Second and shut him up safely for the night in the New Moon doghouse, which had held no dog for years but was still carefully preserved and whitewashed every spring. Emily's heart would have broken if anything had happened to Mike the Second. Old Kelly, the tin peddler, had given him to her. Old Kelly had come through Blairwater every fortnight from May to November for 30 years. Perched on the seat of bright red peddler's wagon behind a dusty, ambling red pony of that peculiar gait and appearance pertaining to the ponies of county peddlers. A certain placid, unhasting leanness as of a nag that has encountered troubles of his own and has lived them down by sheer patience and staying power. From the bright red wagon proceeding a certain metallic rumbling and clinking as it bowled along on 2 huge nests of tin pans. On its flat, rope-encircled roof flashed back the sunlight so dazzlingly that old Kelly seemed the beaming sun of a little planetary system all of his own. A new broom sticking up aggressively at each of the 4 corners gave the wagon a resemblance to a triumphal chariot. Emily hankered secretly for a ride in old Kelly's wagon. She thought it must be so very delightful. Old Kelly and she were great friends. She liked his red, clean-shaven face under his plug hat, his nice twinkly blue eyes, his brush of upstanding sandy hair, and his comical pursed-up mouth, the shape... oh, gosh. 1, 2, 3. And his comical pursed-up mouth, the shape of which was partly due to nature and partly to too much whistling. He always had a little 3-cornered paper bag of lemon drops for her, or a candy stick of many colors which he smuggled into her pocket when Aunt Elizabeth wasn't looking. And he never forgot to tell her that he supposed she'd soon be thinking of getting married, for old Kelly thought the surest way to please a female creature of any age was to tease her about getting married. One day, instead of candy, he produced a plump gray kitten from the back drawer of his wagon and told her it was for her. Emily received the gift rapturously, but after old Kelly had rattled away Aunt Elizabeth told her they did not want any more cats at New Moon. "Oh, please let me keep it," Aunt Elizabeth, Emily begged. "It won't be a bit of bother to you. I have had experience in bringing up cats. And I'm so lonesome. Saucy Sal is getting so wild running with the barn cats, and I can't associate with her like I used to, and she never was nice to cuddle. Please, Aunt Elizabeth." Aunt Elizabeth would not and did not please. She was in a very bad humor that day. Anyhow, nobody knew just why. In such a mood, she was entirely unreasonable. She wouldn't listen to anybody. Laura and Cousin Jimmy had to hold their tongues, and Cousin Jimmy was bidden to take the gray kitten down to the Blair water and drown it. Emily burst into tears over this cruel command, and this aggravated Aunt Elizabeth still further. She was so cross that Cousin Jimmy dared not smuggle the kitten up to the barn as he had first planned to do. "Take that beast down to the pond, throw it in, and come back and tell me you've done it," said Elizabeth angrily. "I mean to be obeyed. Newman is not going to be made a dumping ground for old Jock Kelly's cats." Cousin Jimmy did as he was told, and Emily would not eat any dinner. Then after dinner, she stole mournfully away through the old orchard, down the pasture to the pond. Just why she went she couldn't have told, but she felt that she must. When she reached the bank of the little creek where Lofty John's brook ran into Blair water, she heard piteous shrieks, and there, marooned on a tiny islet of sere marsh grass in the creek, was an unhappy little beast, its soaking fur plastered against its sides, shivering and trembling in the wind of the sharp autumnal day. The old oat bag in which Cousin Jimmy had imprisoned it was floating out onto the pond. Emily did not stop to think or look for a board or count the consequences. She plunged in the creek up to her knees and waded out to the dump of grass and caught the kitten up. She was so hot with indignation that she didn't feel the cold of the water or the chill of the wind as she ran back to New Moon. A suffering or tortured animal always filled her with such a surge of sympathy that it lifted her clean out of herself. She burst into the cookhouse where Aunt Elizabeth was frying donuts. "Aunt Elizabeth," she cried, "the kitten wasn't drowned after all, and I am going to keep it." "You're not," said Aunt Elizabeth. Emily looked her aunt right in her face. Again she felt that odd sensation that had come when Aunt Elizabeth brought the scissors to cut her hair. "Aunt Elizabeth, this poor little kitten is cold and starving, and oh, so miserable. It has been suffering for hours. It shall not be drowned again." Archibald Murray's look was on her face, and Archibald Murray's tone was in her voice, and this happened only when the deeps of her being were stirred by some peculiarly poignant emotion. Just now she was in an agony of pit. No, just now she was in a pit of agony and despair. When Elizabeth Murray saw her father looking out at her from Emily's little white face again, she surrendered without a struggle, rage at herself, as she might afterwards for her weakness. It was her one vulnerable point. The thing might not have been so uncanny if Emily had resembled the Murrays, but to see the Murray look so suddenly superimposed like a mask over alien features was such a shock to her nerves that she could not stand up against it. A ghost from the grave could not have cowed her more speedily. She turned her back on Emily in silence, but Emily knew that she had won her second victory. The gray kitten stayed at New Moon and waxed fat and lovable, and Aunt Elizabeth never took the slightest notice of its existence save to sweep it out of the house when Emily was not about. But it was weeks before Emily was really forgiven, and she felt uncomfortable enough over it. Aunt Elizabeth could be a not generous conqueror, but she was very disagreeable in defeat. It was really just as well that Emily could not summon the Murray look at will. Chapter 15, Various Tragedies. Emily, obedient to Aunt Elizabeth's command, had eliminated the word bull from her vocabulary, but to ignore the existence of bulls was not to do away with them, and specifically with Mr. James Lee's English bull, who inhabited the big windy pasture west of Blair water, and who bore a dreadful reputation. He was certainly an awesome-looking creature, and Emily sometimes had fearful dreams of being chased by him and being unable to move. And one sharp November day, those dreams came true. There was a certain well at the far end of the pasture concerning which Emily felt a curiosity. because Cousin Jimmy had told her a dreadful tale about it. The well had been dug 60 years ago by two brothers who lived in a little house which was built down near the shore. It was a very deep well, which was considered a curious thing in that low-lying land near pond and sea. The brothers had gone 90 feet before they found a spring. Then the sides of the well had been stoned up, but the work never went further. Thomas and Silas Lee had quarreled over some trivial difference of opinion as to what kind of a hood should be put over it, and in the heat of his anger, Silas had struck Thomas on the head with his hammer and killed him. The well house was never built. Silas Lee was sent to prison for manslaughter and died there. The farm passed to another brother, Mr. James Lee's father, who moved the house to the other end of it and planked the well over. Cousin Jimmy said that Tom Lee's ghost was supposed to haunt the scene of his tragic death, but he couldn't vouch for that, though he had written a poem on it. A very eerie poem it was, too, and made Emily's blood run cold with a fearful joy when he recited it to her one misty night by the big potato pot. Ever since, she had wanted to see the old well. Her chance came one Saturday when she was prowling alone in the old graveyard. Beyond it lay the Lee pasture, and there was apparently not a sign of a bull in or about it. Emily decided to pay a visit to the old well and went skimming down the field against the sweep of the north wind racing across the gulf. The Wind Woman was a giantess that day, and a mighty swirl she was, stirring up along the shore. But as Emily drew near the big sand dunes, they made a little harbor of calmness around the old well. Emily coolly lifted one of the planks, knelt on the others, and peered down. Fortunately, the planks were strong compared to new, otherwise the small maiden of New Moon might have explored the well more thoroughly than she desired to do. As it was, she could see little of it. Huge ferns grew thickly out of the crevices among the stones of its sides and reached across it, shutting out the view of its gloomy depths. Rather disappointed, Emily replaced the plank and started homeward. She had not gone 10 steps before she stopped. Mr. James Lee's bull was coming straight towards her and was less than 20 yards away. The shore fence was not far behind Emily, and she might possibly have reached it in time had she run, but she was incapable of running. As she wrote that night in her letter to her father, she was paralyzed with terror and could no more move than she could in her dreams of this very occurrence. It's quite conceivable that a dreadful thing might have happened then and there had not a certain boy been sitting on the shore fence. He'd been sitting there unnoticed all the time Emily had been peering into the well. Now he sprang down. Emily saw or sensed a sturdy body dashing past her. The owner thereof ran to within 10 feet of the bull, hurled a stone squarely into the monster's hairy face, and then sped off at right angles towards the side fence. The bull, thus insulted, turned with a menacing rumble and lumbered off after this intruder. "Run now!" screamed the boy over his shoulder to Emily. Emily did not run. Terrified as she was, there was something in her that would not let her run until she saw whether her gallant rescuer made good his escape. He reached his fence in the nick of time. Then, and not till then, Emily ran too and scrambled over the shore fence just as the bull started back across the pasture, evidently determined to catch somebody. Trembling, she made her way through the spiky grass of the sandhills and met the boy at the corner. They stood and looked at each other for a moment. The boy was a stranger to Emily. He had cheery, clean-cut face with keen gray eyes and plenty of tawny curls. He wore as few clothes as decency permitted and had only the pretense of a hat. Emily liked him. There was nothing of Teddy's subtle charm in him, but he had a certain forceful attraction that was all his own, and he had just saved her from a terrible death. "Thank you," said Emily shyly, looking up at him with great gray eyes that looked blue under her long lashes. It was a very effective look, which lost nothing of effectiveness from being wholly unconscious. Nobody had yet told Emily how very winsome that shy, sudden-up glance of hers was. "Isn't he a rip snorter?" said the boy easily. He thrust his hands into his ragged pockets and stared at Emily so fixedly that she dropped her eyes in confusion, thereby doing further damage with those demure lids and silken fringes. "He's dreadful," she said with a shudder, "and I was so scared." "Were you now? And me thinking you were full of grit to be standing there like that looking at him, cool as a cucumber. What's it like to be afraid? Weren't you ever afraid? Asked Emily. No, don't know what it's like, said the boy carelessly and a bit boastfully. What's your name? Emily Bird Starr, she said. You live around here? I live at New Moon, where Simple Jimmy Murray lives. He isn't simple, corrected Emily. Oh, all right, I don't know him, but I'm going to. I'm going to hire him for a chore boy for the winter. I didn't know, said Emily. Are you really? Yeah, I didn't know myself till just this minute. He was asking Aunt Tom about me last week, but I didn't mean to hire out then. Now I guess I will. Want to know my name? Of course, she said. Perry Miller. I live with my old beast of an Aunt Tom down at Stovepipe Town. Dad was a sea captain, and I used to sail with him when he was alive, sailed everywhere. You go to school? Yeah, I don't, he said. Never did. Aunt Tom lives so far away anyhow, I don't think I'd like it. I guess I'll go now, though. Can you read? Asked Emily wonderingly. Yeah, some. And figured Dad lured me some when he was alive. I ain't bothered with it since then. I'd rather be down around the harbor. Great fun there, but if I make up my mind to go to school, I'll learn like thunder, I suppose. You're awful clever. No, not very. Father said I was a genius, but Aunt Elizabeth says I'm just weird. What's genius? I don't know. Sometimes it's a person who writes poetry. I write poetry. Perry stared at her. I'll write poetry too, then. I don't believe you could write poetry, said Emily a little disdainfully. Teddy can't, and he's very clever. Who's Teddy? A friend of mine. There was just a trace of stiffness in Emily's voice. Then, said Perry, folding his arms, I'm going to punch this friend of yours. You're not, cried Emily. She was very indignant and quite forgot for the moment that Perry had rescued her from the bull. She tossed her own head and started homeward, and Perry turned too. May as well go up and see Jimmy Murray about hiring before I go home, he said. Don't be mad now. If you don't want anybody's head punched, I won't punch it. Only you've got to like me too. Why, of course I'll like you, said Emily, as if there could be no question about it. She smiled her slow, blossoming smile at Perry and thereby reduced him to hopeless bondage. 2 days later, Perry Miller was installed as chore boy at New Moon, and in a fortnight's time, Emily felt as if he must have been there always. Aunt Elizabeth didn't want Cousin Jimmy to hire him, she wrote to her father, because he was one of the boys who did a dreadful thing one night last fall. They changed all the horses that were tied to the fence one Sunday night when preaching was going on, and when the folks came out, the confusion was awful. Aunt Elizabeth said it wouldn't be safe to have him around the place, but Cousin Jimmy said it was awful hard to get a chore boy, and that we owe Perry something for saving my life from the bull. So Aunt Elizabeth gave in and lets him sit at the table with us, but he has to stay in the kitchen in the evenings. The rest of us are in the sitting room, but I'm allowed to go out and help Perry with his lessons. He can only have one candle, and the light's very dim. It keeps us snuffing it all the time. It's great fun to snuff candles. Perry's head of his class at school already. He's only in the 3rd book, although he's nearly 12. Miss Brownwell said something sarcastic to him the first day in school, and he just threw back his head and laughed, loud and long. Miss Brownwell gave him a whipping for it, but she's never been sarcastic to him again. She doesn't like to be laughed at, I can see that now. Perry isn't afraid of anything. I thought he might not go to school anymore when she whipped him, but he says a little thing like that isn't going to keep him from getting an education, since he made up his mind to do it. He's very determined. Aunt Elizabeth's determined too, but she says Perry's stubborn. I'm teaching Perry grammar. He says he wants to learn to speak properly. I told him he should not call his Aunt Tom an old beast, but he said he had to because she wasn't a young beast. He says the place he lives in is called Stovepipe Town because the houses have no chimneys, only pipes. But he would live in a mansion someday. Aunt Elizabeth says I ought not be so friendly with the hired boy, but he's a nice boy, though his manners are crude. Aunt Laura says they're crude. I don't know what it means, but I guess it means that he always says what he thinks right out and eats beans with his knife. I like Perry, but in a different way from Teddy. Isn't it funny, dear father, how many kinds of ways of liking there are? I don't think Elise likes him. She makes fun of his ignorance and turns up her nose at him because his clothes are patched. Though her own clothes are weird enough, Teddy doesn't like him much, and he drew such a funny picture of Perry hanging by his heels from a gallows. His face looked like Perry's, and still it didn't. Cousin Jimmy said it was a caricature and laughed at it, but I dared not show it to Perry for fear he would punch Teddy's head. I showed it to Elise and she got mad and tore it in two. I can't imagine why. Perry says he can recite as well as Elise and could draw pictures too if he put his mind to it, but I can see he doesn't like to think anybody can do anything that he can't. But he can't see the wallpaper in the air like I can, though he tries until I fear he'll strain his eyes. He can make better speeches than any of us. He says he used to mean to be a sailor like his father, but now he thinks he'll be a lawyer when he grows up and go to Parliament. Teddy's going to be an artist if his mother will let him, and Elise is going to be a concert reciter. If there's another name, I don't know how it's spelled, but I'm going to be a poetess. I think we're a talented crowd. Perhaps that's a vain thing to say, dear father, but it's true. A very terrible thing happened the day before yesterday. On Saturday morning, we were at family prayers, all kneeling quite solemn around the kitchen. I just looked at Perry once and he made such a funny face at me that I laughed right out loud before I could help it. That wasn't even the terrible thing. Elizabeth was very angry. I could not tell her that it was Perry who made me laugh because I was afraid he might get sent away. So Aunt Elizabeth said I was to be punished and I was not let to go to Jenny Strang's party in the afternoon. Perry was away with Cousin Jimmy all day. When he came home at night, he said to me very fierce, "Who's been making you cry?" I said I'd been crying, a little but not much, because I was not to go to the party because I'd laughed at prayers. And Perry marched right up to Aunt Elizabeth and told her it was all his fault that I laughed. And Aunt Elizabeth said I shouldn't have laughed anyhow, but Aunt Laura was grievously upset and said my punishment had been far too severe. And she said that she would let me wear her pearl ring to school Monday to make up for it. I was enraptured, for it's such a lovely ring, and no other girl has one. And as soon as roll call was over Monday morning, I put my hand up to ask Miss Bramwell a question, but really to show off my ring. That was wicked pride, and I was punished. At recess, Cora Lee, one of the big girls in the 6th class, came and asked me to let her wear the ring for a while. I didn't want to, but she said if I didn't, she wouldn't let all the girls in my class send me to Coventry. Or she would get all the girls in my class to send me to Coventry, which is a dreadful thing, dear father. It makes you feel like an outcast. So I let her, and she kept it on till afternoon recess, and then she came and told me she had lost it in the brook. This was the terrible thing. Oh, father, I was nearly wild. I dared not go home and face Aunt Laura. I had promised her I would be so careful. I thought I might earn money to get her another ring, but when I figured it out on my slate, I knew I would have to wash dishes for 20 years to be able to afford it. I wept in my despair. Perry saw me after school and he marched up to Coralie and said, "You fork over that ring or I'll tell Miss Brownwell about it." And Coralie forked it over. Very meek, and I said I was going to give it to her anyhow. I was just playing a joke. And Perry said, "Don't you play any more jokes on Emily or I'll joke you." It's very comforting to have such a champion. I tremble to think what it would have been like if I had had to go home and tell Aunt Laura I had lost her ring. But it was cruel of Coralie to tell me she'd lost it when she hadn't. When I got home, I looked up in the glass to see if my hair had turned white. I'm told that sometimes it happens, but it hadn't. Perry knows more geography than any of us because he's been nearly everywhere in the world with his father. He tells me such fascinating stories after his lessons are done. He talks till the candle is burned to the last inch, and then he uses that to go to bed with, up the black hole into the kitchen loft, because Aunt Elizabeth will not let him have more than one candle a night. Elise and I had a fight yesterday, about which we'd rather be Joan of Arc or Frances Willard. It didn't begin as a fight, but just as an argument, but it ended that way. I would rather be Frances Willard because she's live. We had the first snow yesterday. I made a poem about it, and here it is. Along the snow the sunbeams glide. Earth is a peerless gleaming bride, dripping with diamonds, clad in trailing white. No bride was ever half so fair and bright. I read it off to Perry, and he said he could make poetry just as good, and he said right off, "Mike has made a long row of tracks across the snow." Now, isn't that as good as yours? I didn't think it was, because you could say it just as well in prose, but when you talk of peerless gleaming brides in prose, it sounds funny. Mike did make a little row of tracks right across the barn field, and they look so pretty, but not so pretty as the mice tracks in some flour Cousin Jimmy spilled on the granary floor. They're the dearest little things. They look like poetry. Story winter has come because Lise and I can't play in our house in Lofty John's bush anymore until spring, or outside at the tansy patch. Sometimes we play indoors at the tansy patch, but Mrs. Kent makes us feel queer. She sits and watches us all the time. So we don't go only when Teddy coaxes very hard. And the pigs have been killed, the poor things, so Cousin Jimmy doesn't boil for them anymore, but there is one consolation. I don't have to wear a sunbonnet to school now. Aunt Laura made me such a pretty red hood with ribbons on it, at which Aunt Elizabeth looked scornfully, saying it was too extravagant. I like school here better every day, but I can't like Miss Brownwell. She isn't fair. She told us she would give us the one who wrote the best composition a pink ribbon to wear from Friday night to Monday. I wrote the Brook story about the brook in Lofty John's bush, all its adventures and thoughts. And Miss Brownwell said I must have copied it, and Rhoda Stewart got the ribbon. Aunt Elizabeth said, "You waste enough time reading trash. I think you might have won that ribbon." She was mortified, I think, because I had disgraced New Moon by not getting it, but I did not tell her what had happened. Teddy says a good sport never whines over losing. I want to be a good sport. Rhoda's so hateful to me now. She says she's surprised that a New Moon girl should have hired a boy for a beau. That's very silly because Perry's not my beau. Perry told her she had more gab than sense. That was not polite, but it's true. One day in class, Rhoda said the moon was situated east of Canada. Perry laughed right out. Miss Brownwell made him stay in at recess. But she never said anything to Rhoda for saying such a ridiculous thing, but the meanest thing Rhoda said was that she had forgiven me for the way I'd used her. And that made my blood boil when I hadn't done anything to be forgiven for. The idea of it. We've begun to eat the big beef ham that hung in the southwest corner of the kitchen. The other Wednesday, Perry and I helped Cousin Jimmy pick a road through the turnips in the first cellar. We have to go through it to the second cellar because the outside hatch is banked up now. It was great fun. We had a candle stuck up in a hole in the wall, and it made such lovely shadows that we could eat all the apples we wanted from the big barrel in the corner, and the spirit moved Cousin Jimmy to recite some of his poetry as he threw the turnips. I'm reading the Alhambra. It belongs to our bookcase. Aunt Elizabeth does not like to say it isn't for me to read because it was one of her father's books, but I don't believe she approves because she knits very furiously and looks black at me over her glasses. Teddy lent me Hans Andersen stories. I love them, only I always think of a different end for the Ice Maiden and save Rudy. They say Mr. John Killigrew has swallowed her wedding ring, or Mrs. John Killigrew. I wonder what she did for that. Cousin Jimmy says there's to be an Elpkins in the sun in December. I hope it won't interfere with Christmas. My hands are chapped. Aunt Laura rubs mutton tallow on them every night when I go to bed. It's hard to write poetry with chapped hands. I wonder if Mrs. Hemans ever had chapped hands. It doesn't mention anything like that in her biography. Jimmy Ball has to be a minister when he grows up. His mother told Aunt Laura that she consecrated him to it in his cradle. I wonder how she did it. We have breakfast by candlelight now, and I like it. Elise was up here Sunday afternoon, and we went to the garret and talked about God because that's proper to do on Sundays. It's a tradition of New Moon to keep Sundays very holy. Grandfather Murray was very strict. Cousin Jimmy told me a story about him. They always cut the wood for Sunday on Saturday night. But one time they forgot and there was no wood on Sunday to cook the dinner. So Grandfather Murray said, "You must not cut wood on Sundays, boys, but just break a little with the back of the axe." Elise is very curious about God, although she doesn't believe in him most of the time and doesn't like to talk about him, but still wants to find out about him. She says she thinks she might like him if she knew him. She spells his name with a capital G now because it's best to be on the safe side. I think God's just like my flash, only it lasts only a second, and he always lasts. We talked so long we got hungry, and I went down to the sitting room cupboard and got 2 donuts. I forgot Aunt Elizabeth told me I could not have donuts between meals. It wasn't stealing, it was just forgetting. But Elise got mad at the last and said I was a she-Jacobite, whatever that is, and a thief, and that no Christian would steal donuts from her poor old aunt. So I went and confessed to Aunt Elizabeth, and she said I was not to have a donut at supper. It was hard to see the others eating them. I thought Perry ate his very quick, but after supper he beckoned me outdoors. and gave me half of his donut. He wrapped it on his handkerchief, which was not very clean, but I ate it because I didn't want to hurt his feelings. Aunt Laura says Elise has a nice smile. I wonder if I have a nice smile. I looked at the glass in Elise's room and smiled, but it didn't seem very nice. Now the nights have got cold. Aunt Elizabeth always puts a gin jar full of hot water in the bed. I like to put my toes against it. This is all we use the gin jars for nowadays, but Grandfather Murray used to keep real gin in it. Now that the snow has come, Cousin Jimmy can't work in his garden anymore and he's very lonesome. I think the garden is just as pretty in winter as in summer. There are such pretty dimples in the baby hills where the snow has covered up the flower beds, and in the evenings it's all pink and rosy at sunset, and by moonlight it's like a dreamland. I like to look out of the sitting room window at it and watch the rabbit's candles floating in the air above it and wonder what all the little roots and seeds are thinking of down under the snow. And it gives me a lovely creepy feeling to look at it through the red glass of the front door. There's a beautiful fringe of icicles along the cookhouse roof, but there'll be much more beautiful things in heaven. I was reading about it today and it made me feel religious. Good night, my dearest of fathers. P.S. That doesn't mean I have any father. It's just a way of saying very, very dear. Love, Emily Bird Star. And that, my friends, is the end of chapter 15. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you are having a great weekend, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Bye.